Hello and welcome, I'm Joshua Barnes and you're watching NewsX World. Let's first take a look at our top stories. Ukraine says that Russia has launched a huge attack on its capital, leaving at least 15 people injured. The reported overnight missile and drone assault comes as talks over a ceasefire continue to stall after brief but direct discussions in Istanbul earlier this month. Meanwhile, Russia and Ukraine have both confirmed that 307 prisoners of war have been exchanged on the second day of a swap. Both countries agreed to return 1,000 troops at the talks in Turkey. At least 76 people have reportedly been killed following Israeli land and air offensives in the Gaza Strip. A hospital in Khan Yunis says that a recent Israeli strike hit the home of one of their doctors and killed 9 of her 10 children. A US judge has temporarily blocked the Trump administration from stopping Harvard University from enrolling international students. Trump has already cut billions in funding for the Ivy League school amid ongoing disputes over free speech and anti-Semitism on campus. The European Union's trade chief says the bloc is committed to securing a trade deal with the US based on respect and not threats. It comes as President Trump threatened a 50% tariffs on all EU goods going into the States, saying he was not looking for a deal with the EU. Syria's new government have hailed the Trump administration's lifting of US sanctions as a positive step. This follows similar moves from other Western nations as the new government moves on from the rule of ousted Bashar al-Assad. An all-party delegation from India is in Bahrain as the country continues reaching out to countries following the Pahalgam terror attack and tensions with Pakistan. The Indian embassy in Bahrain says cross-border terrorism will be highlighted in all engagements. The International Monetary Fund says it has held constructive talks with Pakistani officials over the country's upcoming budget. The IMF says bailout funds cannot support the government budget, saying deviations will impact the Pakistan programme. We start in the Middle East. The Gaza Health Ministry has reported a sharp rise in civilian casualties as Israeli airstrikes continue to hit the Strip. In one strike, 9 of a Gaza doctor's 10 children were killed when their home in Khan Yunis was bombed. Her husband and one child survived but was injured. In Al-Mawasi, a designated humanitarian zone, at least 5 people were killed and 50 wounded in an attack while they were gathered around a truck carrying flour, also confirmed by the health ministry. 4 more people were killed in another strike in the tougher area of Gaza City, while Israeli raids continued in Deir el-Balah. The health ministry adds that only 92 aid trucks have entered Gaza in the last 3 days. This statement comes as Israel claims that 107 and 83 aid trucks have entered the enclave in the past 2 days, respectively. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres warned that a teaspoon of aid is being let through when a flood is needed. Let's listen in to the EU chief's comments.
Palestinians in Gaza are enduring what may be the cruelest phase of this cruel conflict. For nearly 80 days, Israel blocked the entry of life-saving international aid. As the world's leading hunger assessment found, the entire population of Gaza is facing the risk of famine. Families are being starved and denied the very basics, all with the world watching in real time.
Meanwhile, Arab foreign ministers met their French counterparts in Paris to push for a Gaza ceasefire and urge implementation of a 2-state solution. A global conference on this is planned for June in New York. On the other hand, more than 50 hostages, both dead and alive, are still being held by Hamas. Well, joining us to discuss these developments is Ross Feingold, political risk analyst, who's joining us from Taipei. Ross, thank you ever so much for being here. Of course, the situation in Gaza, we know, has worsened since military operations were resumed by Israel, but we have seen somewhat of a shift amongst global leaders. We heard comments there from the UN chief Antonio Guterres. Why do you think there has been a clear shift from some world leaders in terms of a response to Israel for the ongoing offensive?
I think you just used the key word, which is ongoing. And the situation, if we go back in time, 6 months, a year, there have been previous predictions of a famine in Gaza. The war went on. There was a brief ceasefire. The problem for Israel that it has to confront is that the situation is ongoing. Israel is continuing to prosecute the war against Hamas. But in the meantime, civilians are caught in the crossfire. And of course, supplies that have been existing have been trucked in during the previous ceasefire. No surprise that they're dwindling. And we see global opinion, other than the United States, which is firmly in support of Israel still, but global opinion, especially in Europe, is shifting against Israel.
Absolutely, Ross. Some discrepancies between the amount of aid that Gaza and different bodies have said has gone in compared with Israel. Of course, aid is a huge concern with fears of starvation. Do you think pressure needs to be put on these organisations and also Israel to make sure that that aid does get in before an extreme situation? Of course, the US said that they were going to be involved in some form of aid distribution. Could the US be involved in further talks surrounding that?
Well, there was the US-Israel plan to distribute aid, which the UN and other stakeholders said they want no part of. So that is, at the moment, very much in doubt. Part of the challenge is Israel says it lets the trucks in, but then do the goods actually get distributed to civilians who are in need? And that's part of the challenge in a situation where hostilities are ongoing. We shouldn't forget the fact that we're talking about how to distribute aid when very close by to where civilians are, Israel and Hamas are engaged in a shooting war. There's hostilities ongoing. And one of the big concerns from Israel, and they've made this abundantly clear, is that they want to make sure that any aid that enters Gaza and gets distributed goes to civilians. It's not stolen by Hamas. And no one's really come up with the perfect solution to that problem, absent having a ceasefire again, which at the moment doesn't seem like it's going to happen despite on again, off again talks.
Yes, Ross, there has been a report that on Friday, 9 children who were the children of a doctor working in Gaza were killed, 9 of the 10. Reports like this have been verified. This one was verified by the BBC. Given the amount of death that's being seen amongst children and also women as well, do you think that there could potentially be a change in approach from Israel, given that condemnation that we've spoken about, which world leaders seem to be sort of joining along with the aid blockade that was in place? Do you think this will change Benjamin Netanyahu's plan of ultimately controlling the whole of Gaza, which is something he's repeated recently?
Up to now, international criticism or the number of children or females who have died in the war, that has not changed how Israel goes about fighting Hamas. So I would have to say we need to look at the past and see that Israel does not change the way it conducts the war, notwithstanding the civilian deaths, including women and children. And even international pressure or Israel's image taking a hit hasn't really changed how Israel goes about conducting the war. Israel would say that this is up to Hamas. We could solve this if Hamas would surrender, lay down their weapons, and depart Gaza. Now, Hamas is not willing to do that, and we're stuck in the same situation.
Absolutely, and another key part of that for Benjamin Netanyahu and his government, of course, is the hostages. Over 50, we know, dead and alive, still being held by Hamas. Of course, the devastation this is causing within Israel and across the world as well. Do you think this is a factor that might sway Benjamin Netanyahu's thinking? He's resumed military activity in Gaza following that ceasefire that was agreed at the start of the year. Since then, only 1 hostage released. Do you think a different change in approach might see more hostages released, or is this now just a way in which Netanyahu sees Hamas being got rid of, potentially with collateral damage of further hostages dying?
The interesting thing there is that there's a lot of domestic criticism in Israel by families of the remaining hostages, by other members of the public. They've held many protests. They've been very vociferous in their view that Netanyahu's way of conducting the war is wrong. He should stop. He should reach a ceasefire and get those remaining 50 hostages released. But Netanyahu and his government, they don't agree. They're immune to the international criticism, and they're certainly immune to the domestic criticism, it seems. And they're going to continue to conduct the war until they feel that Hamas is militarily defeated, with the hope that when that point in time comes, that Hamas will release the remaining hostages. We're not there yet. It's clear that Hamas still has retained a fighting capability, so Israel and Netanyahu's government continues to fight the war.
Ross Feingold, as always, thank you so much for your insight. We, of course, will be across all of the developments from Gaza and the wider Middle East as we get them. But we move now to Europe. Russia and Ukraine have exchanged 307 prisoners of war from each country today, according to the Russian Defense Ministry. This is the second day of the biggest prisoner swap in over 3 years of the Russia-Ukraine war. Meanwhile, Ukraine's military intelligence agency claims that Moscow has executed more than 150 prisoners of war after they surrendered to Russian forces. On the other hand, meanwhile, at least 14 people were injured after Russia attacked Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, earlier today with drones and missiles, triggering fires and strewing debris in districts throughout the city, according to the city's mayor. According to reports, sites in the Ukrainian regions of Dnipropetrovsk, Odessa and Zaporizhia were also hit, with Ukrainian forces saying 6 of the ballistic missiles were shot down by their air defences, along with at least 245 drones, many of which were said to be Iranian designed. This comes as Russia's Ministry of Defense said at least 94 Ukrainian drones attempted to strike Russian targets overnight. It said 64 unmanned aerial vehicles were downed overnight in the skies of Belgorod, along with 10 additional drones launched on Saturday morning. Dozens more projectiles were downed over Kursk, Lipetsk and Voronezh, and another 5 were shot down over Tver, northwest of Moscow. Meanwhile, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has stated that European countries had encouraged Kyiv to launch the drone attacks to undermine peace efforts. On the other hand, 2 Russian military aircraft are suspected of having violated Finnish airspace, according to Finland's defence ministry. Well, lots of developments in the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war to discuss, and joining us to do that is Gilbert Doctorow, a Russian affairs expert who is joining us from Brussels. Gilbert, as always, thank you for being here with us this evening. Let's first look at this prisoner of war exchange, something which came out of these direct talks which took place in Istanbul between Russia and Ukraine. While peace wasn't agreed, this was a good forward step, and it seems to be moving forward. What's your opinion on these deals and the second day of prisoners being exchanged?
Well, it's wonderful that they're being exchanged. This is to the benefit of families in both Russia and in Ukraine, who will see their sons, their husbands, their fathers return to their midst and alive and functioning. However, it's a mistake to view this as a simple process, and I'll explain why in a minute. And it's still more important that we can understand that it doesn't reflect in any way on the chances for talks between the two parties leading to a ceasefire or to a peace, because they are so far apart. Each side, the Russian side and the Ukrainian side, essentially is calling for a settlement that involves the capitulation of the other side. Considering that Ukraine is the losing side, it's especially absurd, and the Russian demand for capitulation is premature, shall we say, because Ukraine has not gone through all of its resources to date. As for the complications around the prisoner exchange, which are not obvious, these are not just soldiers who are being exchanged, they're also civilians. In the case of the Russians who were being returned to Russia, many of them were seized, were captured inside the Russian Federation in Kursk Oblast or region when that was invaded by the Ukrainians. They took back to Ukraine many civilians, obviously with intent to do what they're doing now, to exchange them for Ukrainian soldiers who are prisoners of war in Russia. There is a dispute over which exactly soldiers Russia is willing to give up in this exchange, because as I understand, Ukrainians have demanded that members of the Azov battalion, that is the most vicious neo-Nazi militants who were so important in holding out in Mariupol early in this war, that they be exchanged for Russian prisoners of war. And the Russians, of course, are saying no, that will not happen. So although the first exchange has been rather large, more than 250, as you say, on each side, I would not be certain that the further exchanges will be so quick.
Yes, and I just want to clarify that those comments there are Gilbert's opinion and not those of NewsX World. Let's now, Gilbert, look specifically at the drone strikes that we've seen from both sides. Of course, Kyiv was targeted. We know that Russia has also been targeted by Ukraine. Given the dialogue and the rhetoric that there has been around finding a ceasefire, strikes at this level, how do they damage potential peace?
Well, I think they have no impact on potential peace. The potential peace is in great difficulty for the reasons I explained a moment ago, because the two sides are so far apart in their expectations of what will be concluded. But as to these strikes, these drone strikes, the Russians are saying that in the last week there was an unprecedented high level of Ukrainian drone strikes in Russia, many of them directed against Moscow. And they say that they shot down more than 1,000 airplane-like and other drones that the Ukrainians had sent into the Russian Federation, hundreds of kilometers away from the war zone in Ukraine itself. The Russians said that in return for this massive drone strikes, they would do something that would catch the Ukrainians' attention. And what they did is precisely what you described, this enormous attack on the city of Kiev, which there were other attacks, as you also cited, in other major cities, including Odessa. But the city of Kiev was the main focus of Russian attention in their revenge attack for the last week's drones that were sent to their territory.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, I do want to bring it back to these peace discussions, Gilbert. We mentioned at the beginning of the programme about these talks in Turkey and of course the impact that that's had on this prisoner exchange. But we don't know when the next direct talks will be. It seems that the rhetoric from Ukraine and their Western allies is work towards a 30-day peace deal. Where does Russia stand on that, and how does Russia get the assurances it needs to work towards a peace deal?
Well, the Russians have made it plain that they will not discuss a ceasefire until there is agreement in a memorandum which they and the Ukrainians are both drafting presently for what the end game will be, what the outcome of the negotiations for peace may look like. But let's assume that in the next few days, each side completes and sends to the other side their memorandum, and then there'll be a meeting, obviously, to discuss face-to-face how the differences in these memorandums can be reconciled. This also has to be borne in mind when you're talking about the schedule for meetings, that the Russians and Ukrainians both had agreed there would be no further talks until the prisoner exchange was completed, and that will take, one can guess, a few more days. So let's assume that in a 2-week frame period, there will be resumption of talks, most likely in Istanbul.
Yes, and Gilbert, to bring an end to this discussion, of course Putin was the person who sort of announced these talks that should take place on the 15th of May. which then ended up being delayed and, of course, not involving either Volodymyr Zelensky or Vladimir Putin. Do you think any future direct talks between Russia and Ukraine need to have both Zelensky and Putin present, potentially with someone like Donald Trump mediating?
Well, Donald Trump has already stated very clearly he will not mediate anything. As he's explained, in a move to sideline the Europeans, who are very keen to take part in any of these discussions, the Ukrainians and the Russians uniquely know what has to be resolved between them, and therefore outsiders like himself, or of course the European Union member states, have no place at those negotiations. So we can assume that they will be face to face. There will be security from the host, as was the case in Istanbul, but there will be no American presence at the talks. There's a lot of discussion going on. The American newspapers were reporting that Donald Trump has wanted to change the Russians to change their team, particularly taking objection to Mr. Medinsky, who is the direct assistant to President Putin, heading this delegation. I think it's very doubtful the Russians will do anything to change the composition of their team, least of all at the urging of outsiders like the United States. So we can be sure that the talks will resume. They will focus first on the exchange of memorandums and to see whether or not there's any way of bringing the positions set out in those memorandums closer together. Yeah. That's the next stage.
Gilbert Doctorow, thank you ever so much for your time. We will, of course, continue to monitor all the developments from the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war and any future peace talks. But we now move on to North America, and a US judge has temporarily blocked the Trump administration's move to strip Harvard University of its ability to enroll foreign students. The ruling follows a lawsuit filed by Harvard, which argues that the administration's decision to revoke access to the Student and Exchange Visitor Program is a violation of law and free speech rights. The administration claims Harvard has not done enough to combat anti-Semitism and address its hiring and admissions practices, which the university strongly denies. The restraining order pauses the government's attempt to remove Harvard from the SEVP database, a key tool for managing foreign students. The legal battle has sparked uncertainty among the 6,800 international students at Harvard, who make up over a quarter of the student body. Many foreign students, including those from China, India and the United Kingdom, are concerned about deportation or being unable to complete their studies. Harvard's international students contribute significantly to the university's finances, with many paying full tuition. The case may eventually reach the US Supreme Court, with Harvard vowing to continue its legal fight. Meanwhile, students face an uncertain future, with some fearing they may be forced to transfer or return home. The next court hearing is scheduled for May the 29th. Well, joining us to discuss these developments is Raymond Vickery, the former US Assistant Secretary of Commerce, who's joining us from Washington, D.C. Raymond, as always, thank you ever so much for joining us. This battle between Harvard and the Trump administration continues to move forward. The latest development, this judge temporarily blocking a ban. But let's talk about this move from the Trump administration. Why are they looking at limiting foreign students from enrolling at Harvard University?
Well, thanks very much for having me, Joshua. It's always a pleasure. This is not just a fight between Harvard and the president. What this is an attempt by the President of the United States to crush opposition to his viewpoint and his power. If he can take out Harvard, then as a leading university, other universities, in his thinking, I believe, will fall into line. Great democracies like the US and India in cooperation to build peace and prosperity throughout the world have to operate within a system of the rule of law. And what is going on here is an attempt to circumvent the Constitution of the United States, which clearly provides for freedom of speech, for due process, for equal protection of the laws. It didn't take Judge Burroughs very long to see the unconstitutionality and illegality of this motion and to rule with a temporary restraining order, which requires a showing of irreparable harm. And the irreparable harm, of course, is that Harvard has about a quarter of its students, 27% to be exact, who are from abroad. And if you can eliminate 27% of the student body, along with the other measures that the Trump administration has taken, presumably you can bring them to heel. But again, this is not just about Harvard. This is about taking down opposition in higher education. There is a use of, well, the administration claims to be fighting anti-Semitism. Well, that's very ironic in the view of the fact that the president of Harvard, Alan Garber, is Jewish, has spoken and written about anti-Semitism, and it's just it's a smokescreen. The other point, of course, is diversity, equity, and inclusion, which the administration is trying to do away with. But unfortunately, it's broader than either of these two issues. It's really about retribution. It's really about crushing the opposition and changing the very parameters of the rule of law. So it remains to be seen now what will happen. And of course, the judiciary doesn't have any police or army of its own. And so this is going to be a very, very significant confrontation. And of course, it'll be appealed immediately. It'll doubtlessly go to the Supreme Court, where there is a majority of conservative appointed justices there. But I have every reason to believe that this is such a blatant interference with constitutional rights that Harvard is going not to buckle to this latest onslaught.
Yes, Raymond, we have seen, of course, a drop in funding, federal funding towards Harvard. There's also been incidents with Columbia University as well. But to bring an end to this discussion, I want to raise the question around free speech, and it's something that has been brought up in this topic, also looking at anti-Semitism as well. In this instance, and in this sort of backwards and forwards between educational institutions and the Trump administration, do you think that the line of where free speech is versus anti-Semitism, do you think that's been blurred, or is this just a case of it's what the Trump administration wants and you have to follow exactly in line with what they're saying?
Well, the line between free speech and protection of minorities, anti-Semitism, is always one which is difficult to draw. But here we do not have the kind of situation which would justify infringement on free speech, particularly in the academic setting. You know, there is a Supreme Court decision that says you can't yell fire in a crowded auditorium. It's a restraint. But there's no fire here. What's going on is, as I have said, an attempt to crush opposition. President Trump made it very plain when he was campaigning that he was out after retribution, people who had opposed. So the business about the attacks is clearly an infringement of First Amendment rights to free speech. It's an attempt across the board to eliminate independent thought and criticism. Great democracies, whether they be U.S., India, Western Europe, Japan, cannot exist if you're going to have thought control. George Orwell in 1984 wrote about this. Newspeak, that good means bad, bad means good. And what is going on with President Trump is an attempt to be able to control speech, thought, so that his views and the MAGA supporters will be able to triumph. And of course, Harvard has been a leading academic institution promoting speech on both sides. So sure, there are difficulties, and Alan Garber, president of Harvard, as a leading Jew, has been very sensitive to this. He has said that he has experienced anti-Semitism himself. So the university is doing a good job of defining this line. But that doesn't satisfy President Trump and his supporters, because what they want to do is change the very form of government which we have in the United States. And it's time for other democracies to step up and to assist in terms of insisting upon rule of law, constitutionality, human rights, the right to free speech, upon which the whole enterprise of democracy will fail if those are not protected.
Raymond Vickery, I wish we had more time to speak, but unfortunately we don't. Thank you very much for joining us. That is all for now, but we will be back very soon with more of your latest breaking international news.